She did not cry. She pressed her gloved hand against the ballroom wall, held her breath, and listened to her husband tell another man that marrying her had been nothing more than a business arrangement. The candles kept burning. The music kept playing. And Eleanor Whitmore, wife, daughter, woman, made the quietest and most powerful decision of her life. If love was never coming, she would stop waiting for it. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey to the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Harvest Ball at Carter Manor was the finest event in western Pennsylvania, and everyone who mattered had come to witness it. Lanterns lined the gravel path from the iron gate to the front entrance. Couples arrived in carriages polished to a mirror shine. Women wore their best silk. Men straightened their coats and tucked away their tobacco pipes before stepping across the threshold. The Carter name carried that kind of weight in 1814, the kind that made people stand a little taller just by being near it. Eleanor Carter, born Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of a disgraced judge, had overseen every detail of the evening. The flowers, the menu, the placement of every table and every candle. She had done it quietly, efficiently, and without complaint, the way she did everything inside this house. She stood near the far end of the main hall in a dress the color of deep amber, her chestnut hair pinned back with a simple ivory comb. She was not the most decorated woman in the room. She had never tried to be. But there was something about the way she moved, deliberate, composed, aware, that made people glance at her twice without knowing exactly why. The evening had gone smoothly. She had smiled at the right moments. She had spoken to the wives of Nathaniel's political allies with warmth and intelligence. She had guided the household staff through supper service without a single disruption. She had done her duty. She was doing it still when she stepped through the side corridor to retrieve a handkerchief she had left in the small sitting room near the east parlor. She heard her husband's voice before she reached the door. Nathaniel Carter did not raise his voice often. He did not need to. He had the kind of low, measured tone that commanded a room simply by existing in it. And tonight he was speaking to someone with particular confidence, the easy confidence of a man who believed himself entirely alone. Eleanor slowed. "You must be pleased with yourself," the other voice said. She recognized it. Senator Aldous Greer, a heavy-set man from Philadelphia, with small eyes and a reputation for enjoying other people's discomfort. The Whitmore girl cleaned up well enough. Better than I expected, honestly. There was a pause. Then Nathaniel spoke. "Marrying her was simply the price of protecting my family's future," he said. "Her father's connections were useful at the time. The arrangement made sense." Silence. Eleanor's hand found the doorframe. "And now?" Greer asked, clearly amused. Nathaniel's voice did not change. "Now she manages the household. She does it competently enough. That was all I ever required." Eleanor did not move. She was not sure she could. The music from the ballroom drifted through the corridor, something bright and celebratory, entirely wrong for the moment. She could hear laughter somewhere behind her, the clink of crystal glasses, the ordinary sounds of an evening that had not just collapsed beneath her feet. She stood in that corridor for exactly long enough to understand that she had not misheard and that no explanation was coming. Then she straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her amber dress with both hands, and walked back toward the ballroom. She did not go to the center of the room. She moved along the edge close to the wall, retrieving her wrap from the chair where she had left it. One of the kitchen maids caught her eye and started to say something. Eleanor gave a small, steady shake of her head. Not now. She found the Carter family housekeeper, Mrs. Aldine Pruitt, near the kitchen entrance and spoke quietly into her ear. "I have a headache. Please see that the rest of the evening runs smoothly. Mr. Carter will handle the guests." Mrs. Pruitt looked at her with the careful attention of a woman who had worked in this household for 20 years and understood far more than she was ever paid to say. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. "I'll see to everything." Eleanor nodded once. She left through the side door. The night air hit her like cold water, sharp and real and without ceremony. She walked to the waiting carriage at the far end of the drive, told the driver she was ready, and climbed inside before he could assist her. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed straight ahead as the carriage rolled away from Carter Manor. She did not cry. She had learned very early in life that crying solved nothing. Her father had wept openly the morning the bank came for their house, and it had not stopped a single creditor. Tears were a luxury she had never been able to afford. What she did instead was think. By the time the carriage turned onto the country road that led toward the East Wing entrance, Eleanor had made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. She did not speak it aloud. She did not write it down. She simply held it inside her chest like a stone cold and certain and surprisingly light. If I cannot be loved as a wife, I will become a woman who no longer needs his love. She had been 19 years old when she married Nathaniel Carter. Her father, Judge Harlan Whitmore, had been a respected man in Pittsburgh once. His reputation had made him valuable. His pride had made him reckless. By the time Eleanor was 17, the debts had accumulated to a point that no amount of judicial dignity could paper over. He had borrowed against everything he owned and several things he didn't. When the truth came out, it came out completely. The Carter family's lawyers had arrived within a month of the scandal. There were papers to sign, arrangements to be made. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet, efficient financial negotiation, a marriage had been suggested. Not by Eleanor. She had never been asked. Nathaniel Carter, at 32, had been a man of property and political ambition. He had needed the Whitmore name's remaining social connections in a particular district where his land acquisition plans were being challenged. Eleanor's father had needed his debts erased and his daughter secured. The arrangement had suited everyone who had been consulted. Eleanor had worn a white dress and said the words she was supposed to say, and that had been that. Nathaniel had not been unkind to her. She wanted to be honest about that even now, even with his voice still ringing in her ears. He had not raised his voice at her. He had not humiliated her publicly, at least not intentionally. He provided well. He was civil at meals when he was present, which was rarely. He had given her freedom to manage the household as she saw fit, which she had come to understand was less a gift and more a vacancy. He had no interest in filling himself. He had simply never seen her. That was the most precise way she could describe it. In 5 years of marriage, Nathaniel Carter had looked at her. Really looked at her the way a man looks at a person rather than a fixture, perhaps a handful of times. She had noticed each one. She had told herself for a long time that they meant something, that he was complicated, that he had his reasons, that men like Nathaniel carried wounds that took time to heal, and she simply needed to be patient, to be present, to be worthy enough that eventually he would turn and find her standing there. She had been patient. She had been present. She had been worthy of far more than she'd been given, and none of it had mattered one bit. The morning after the harvest ball, Eleanor rose before dawn. She dressed without calling for her maid. She braided her own hair and pinned it simply at the back of her neck. She went downstairs to the kitchen while the cook was still lighting the stove, poured herself a cup of water, and sat at the long preparation table in the quiet that existed before the household woke. She had a small leather notebook with her, the kind she used for household accounts. She opened it to a fresh page and began to write. Not feelings, not grievances, not the kind of words that would have felt satisfying to put down and later burn. Numbers. She had spent 5 years in Carter Manor learning how everything worked, where the money moved, where it disappeared, which tenant farmers were struggling and why, which suppliers were overcharging and by how much, which repairs had been deferred so long they were becoming crises. She had noticed all of it, had mentioned some of it to Nathaniel over the years, had been nodded at and moved past, without her observations ever being acted upon. She was done mentioning. She began to write out a household audit, systematic, thorough, every line of expenditure she could recall from memory. She was still writing when the cook arrived and stopped in the doorway, uncertain. "Mrs. Carter, you're up early." "I am," Eleanor agreed. "Please don't let me interrupt you." The cook, a stout woman named Bess, who had worked for the Carters since before Nathaniel inherited the estate, set about her work with the particular quietness of someone who knew better than to ask questions before breakfast. Nathaniel appeared in the dining room at his usual hour, 8 o'clock. No earlier, no later. Eleanor was already seated at the table with her notebook and a cup of tea. He looked at her for a moment. "You left early last evening," he said. "I had a headache," she replied. She turned a page in her notebook. "I've been reviewing the household accounts. We are being overcharged by the mill supplier by approximately 14%. I intend to renegotiate the contract this week." A pause. "That's I can have my solicitor look into." "I've already written the letter," she said. She looked up at him steadily. "I'll also be speaking with the Hatch family about their rent situation. 3 of our tenant farms in the southern fields are at risk of defaulting before winter. If we restructure the payment terms now, rather than waiting until they're delinquent, we avoid legal complications and keep productive farmers on our land. It makes better economic sense." Nathaniel stared at her. He had the expression of a man who had expected one conversation and had walked into an entirely different one. "You've been researching this," he said. "I've been aware of it," she corrected pleasantly. "I've simply decided to act on it." She returned to her notebook. He stood in the doorway for another moment, then took his seat at the head of the table, picked up his newspaper, and said nothing more. That was fine. She had not done it for his response. The changes Eleanor made over the following months were not announced. They were not dramatic. They accumulated the way water carves stone, quietly, consistently, without any single moment you could point to and call the turning point. She met with the mill supplier herself, a heavy-set man named Dodd, who had clearly not expected a woman to arrive with documented records of his pricing inconsistencies. He had blustered. He had implied that she ought to have her husband present for such conversations. She had smiled at him with perfect composure and placed the ledger pages on his desk. "I believe the numbers speak for themselves, Mr. Dodd," she said. "I'm prepared to take our contract to the Harmon Mill in the next county if the pricing isn't corrected by the end of the month. I've already spoken with them. They're quite interested." She had not spoken with the Harmon Mill, but she had intended to if necessary, and that was near enough to the truth for her current purposes. Dodd revised the contract. She went to the Hatch farm the following week. Thomas Hatch was a lean man in his late 40s who met her at the gate with the wary expression of someone waiting for bad news. His wife stood a few steps behind him with a toddler on her hip and 2 older children clinging to her skirt. "Mrs. Carter," he said, with the kind of careful politeness people use when they are afraid. "Mr. Hatch," she replied. She stepped down from the carriage herself without waiting for assistance. "I'd like to discuss a revised payment arrangement for the next growing season. May we speak somewhere with a table?" The Hatch family kitchen smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular warmth of a home that was being held together by sheer will. Eleanor sat across from Thomas and his wife Martha, drank the tea Martha offered, even though she could see how little they had, and worked through a restructured rent schedule that would keep them viable through the winter without creating a debt that would follow them for years. By the time she left, Martha Hatch had pressed her hand at the door with something that felt very close to tears. "We didn't think anyone at the manor knew we were struggling," Martha said quietly. "I know," Eleanor said. "And then because it was the truth, I've known for some time. I should have come sooner." She visited 4 other farms that month. She spoke with the local physician, Dr. Emery Cahill, who had been running his practice out of a single room at the edge of the village with almost no supplies and no compensation for treating the poorest families in the valley. She arranged for the manor's household budget to fund a monthly medical visit to each tenant farm. Nothing elaborate, but something. Enough to catch illness before it became crisis. She met with the school teacher, an exhausted young woman named Miss Fenn, who had 12 children of wildly different ages crammed into a single room with 2 functioning primers between them. Eleanor ordered new books from Philadelphia. She donated 3 of the manor's unused tables and had them delivered to the schoolhouse. She organized a small fund contributions from several of the wealthier families in the county for Miss Fenn's salary supplement. Word began to travel through Carter Valley the way good news always does, quietly at first, then all at once. "Have you heard what Mrs. Carter's been doing? She came to the Hatch farm herself, sat right at their table. The school children have new books, every one of them. She renegotiated half the estate contracts, saved 3 families from eviction. She heard none of it directly. But she could feel the shift in the way people looked at her when she passed through the village. The small nods, the warmer greetings. The mothers who held their children's hands and pointed her out, not as the wife of the most powerful man in the valley, but as someone who had come to their doors when they needed help." The heart of Carter Valley. She did not know who had said it first, but it had stuck. Nathaniel noticed. Of course he noticed. He was not an unobservant man. He had built and protected a significant estate through a combination of intelligence, discipline, and an acute attention to everything happening around him. He had simply never applied that attention to his own wife. He began to now, not openly, not in any way he would have admitted if asked directly. But Eleanor caught the moments the way he paused in the doorway of his study when she passed in the hall. The slight delay before he unfolded his newspaper at breakfast, the occasions when she looked up from her ledger and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. She did not remark on it. She had stopped performing for his approval. She no longer arranged herself for his attention. She met his eyes when he spoke to her, she answered him plainly and directly, and then she returned to her work. If that unsettled him, that was his own affair. It was late July when Benjamin Hale arrived. He came from Philadelphia by recommendation of Nathaniel's land agent, an agricultural engineer who had been modernizing farming practices across several large Pennsylvania estates, and had come highly recommended for his work on crop rotation and water management. He was 29, lean and sun-weathered, with an easy manner and the particular openness of someone who had no interest in impressing people for its own sake. He arrived on a Thursday morning, when Nathaniel was in Pittsburgh meeting with the state legislature. Mrs. Pruitt brought him to the garden where Eleanor was reviewing irrigation notes with one of the field overseers. She looked up, assessed him in a moment, and offered her hand. "Mr. Hale, I'm Mrs. Carter. My husband sends his apologies. He's been delayed in the city. I'll be working with you until he returns." Benjamin Hale shook her hand with the comfortable directness of a man who did not find this awkward at all. "That suits me fine, ma'am. Where would you like to start?" She liked him immediately, not in any way that complicated things. Simply the clean, uncomplicated appreciation for someone who spoke plainly, worked hard, and listened when she talked. He did not qualify her observations or suggest she defer to someone with more authority. When she pointed out a drainage problem in the East Fields that had been worsening for 2 years, he crouched down to examine the soil himself, asked her 3 specific questions and said, "You're right. Here's what I'd do about it." They spent the better part of 4 days in the fields together before Nathaniel returned. She showed him everything she had been tracking, the water table measurements she had been recording quietly since her first spring at the manor, the crop yield variations she had mapped across the estate's different sections, the soil problems she had identified but never been able to address because no one had listened when she raised them. Benjamin listened. He also gradually, and without making a production of it, began to talk to her about his own observations about farming communities he had worked with, about families who had lost everything to poor land management, about what good stewardship of the earth actually looked like in practice. He spoke about these things with a quiet passion that Eleanor found genuinely refreshing. They walked the orchard section on the 4th afternoon, a long slope on the south side of the estate that caught full sun and had sitting mostly unused, too rocky for standard grain crops, but too valuable to leave unattended. "Apple trees," Eleanor said. She was standing at the top of the slope looking down at it. "I've thought about it since my first year here. This whole hillside could be an orchard. It would take time, 5-6 years before a real harvest, but the soil here is good and the drainage is natural." Benjamin stood beside her considering. "You'd want to choose the varieties carefully for this climate, but yes." He paused. "It would be extraordinary." She turned to look at him. He was still studying the slope. "No one has ever said that about anything I've suggested," she said. He looked at her then, with something that was simply honest. "Then the people around you haven't been paying attention, Mrs. Carter." Nathaniel returned from Pittsburgh on a Thursday evening to find Benjamin Hale and his wife standing at the edge of the South Orchard slope, deep in conversation about drainage gradients. He stood at the top of the path and watched them for a moment before either of them noticed he was there. Eleanor was gesturing at something in the landscape below. Not the vague, polite gesture of a woman making small talk, but the specific, precise gesture of someone explaining something she understood thoroughly. Hale was nodding, asking something in return. She answered him, and he laughed, genuine, unguarded, and she smiled. Nathaniel had not seen her smile like that in months. He was not sure if he was being honest, that he had ever been the cause of it. Something moved in his chest that he did not immediately identify. It took him until dinner, a meal during which he watched Hale describe a crop rotation system, while Eleanor asked intelligent, targeted questions, and the two of them conducted a conversation that excluded him without intending to, before he recognized the feeling. He was jealous. The recognition was so unexpected that he almost pushed it aside entirely. He was a man of 34 years, a legislator, a landowner. He did not get jealous. Jealousy was for men who were insecure, and he had never been insecure in his life. Except that the feeling did not dissipate. It sat in his chest all through dinner and followed him to his study afterward, where he tried to read a report from his solicitor and found he couldn't concentrate on a word of it. He thought about the harvest ball. He thought about Eleanor leaving early and how he hadn't gone after her, hadn't even wondered until the next morning whether she was all right. He thought about the morning after when she had sat at the breakfast table with her notebook and told him without any visible emotion that she intended to renegotiate the mill contract and restructure the tenant payment system. He had sat across from her and felt, what surprise, a dim awareness that something had shifted. And then he had picked up his newspaper and let the moment pass. He thought about every moment he had let pass in 5 years of marriage. He set down the solicitor's report. He was not certain what he was feeling exactly, but he was beginning to understand for the first time that whatever it was entirely his own doing. He had never given her any reason to remain. The fact that she still had, that she had not only remained, but had transformed everything around her into something remarkable, said something he was not yet ready to articulate. But it sat in him that night, and it did not leave. It was Aunt Abigail who found him in his study at midnight. Abigail Carter was 71 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, and possessed of the particular kind of patience that develops in people who have spent a lifetime watching others make unnecessary mistakes. She had lived at Carter Manor for 11 years since her own husband had passed, and she had observed 5 years of Nathaniel's marriage to Eleanor with the careful silence of a woman who knew that speaking too soon accomplished nothing. She knocked once and walked in without waiting for permission the way she always did. "You're brooding," she said. Nathaniel looked up. "I'm reading." "You've had the same page open for 40 minutes. She settled into the chair across from his desk with the deliberateness of someone who intended to stay. "What's troubling you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, Hale. "The engineer." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "He seems like a perfectly decent young man." "He's decent," Nathaniel agreed. "He also spends every waking hour in the fields with my wife." Abigail studied him. "Eleanor works in the fields too. She has for months. Did you know she's restructured the tenant rental contracts? 3 families would have defaulted before winter without her intervention." "I was aware." "Were you?" Her voice was mild. "When did you become aware of it?" A pause. "Recently," he admitted. Abigail folded her hands in her lap. "She has also funded the schoolhouse, arranged medical visits to every tenant farm, and renegotiated your supply contracts to save the estate, a sum that would have taken your solicitor 6 months to identify." She paused. "People in this valley call her the heart of Carter Valley, Nathaniel. Did you know that?" He did not answer. "She has done all of this." Abigail continued quietly, without recognition, without assistance, and I suspect without any particular expectation that you would notice. The words landed in the room and stayed there. Nathaniel looked at his desk. At the solicitor's report, he had failed to read. At his own hands, which had planted nothing and repaired nothing and built nothing in this valley beyond what had already been handed to him. "She's remarkable," he said. The words came out without decision. "Yes," Abigail agreed simply. "She is." He looked up. "What do I do with that?" Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she said very gently, "I imagine that's exactly the question you should be asking yourself. The difficult part, I think, is that there's no quick answer. And you will have to earn the right to even ask it of her." She rose from the chair, moved to the door, and paused. "She deserves to be seen, Nathaniel," she said. "She has deserved it from the very beginning. The only question now is whether you are capable of being the one to finally do it." She left him with that. He sat in his study for a long time in the dark, and the summer night moved around him, and somewhere in the distance, the south fields lay quiet and promising beneath the stars, fields that Eleanor had mapped and analyzed and planned into a future he had never thought to imagine himself. He had spent 5 years looking past the most important thing in his house, and he was beginning slowly, painfully, without any certainty of what came next, to understand exactly what that had cost him. The morning Benjamin Hale proposed the orchard project in writing, Eleanor was already halfway through her second cup of tea and her third set of irrigation calculations when Nathaniel walked into the dining room and set a folded newspaper on the table without looking at her. That was their marriage in miniature. 2 people in the same house moving through the same spaces, occupying entirely separate worlds. She did not look up. He poured his coffee, sat down, and opened the paper. She heard the familiar crinkle of pages, the small sounds of a man settling into his morning routine. For 5 years, those sounds had meant something to her, had represented a kind of proximity she'd tried to build something from. Now they were simply noise. "The Hale fellow left a report on my desk," Nathaniel said finally. "I know," Eleanor replied. "I reviewed it yesterday. His recommendations for the south fields are sound. I've already spoken with the field overseer about beginning the drainage work next week." A pause. "You reviewed my correspondence." "He submitted copies to both of us," she said pleasantly, "as I requested when he arrived. Is that a problem?" Another pause, longer this time. "No," Nathaniel said. "It isn't." She turned a page in her ledger. He folded his newspaper. Neither of them spoke again for the remainder of breakfast, but something had shifted in the quality of the silence between them. It was no longer the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who had begun, however reluctantly, to pay attention. Eleanor noticed. She filed it away and said nothing about it. She had things to do. The drainage project in the south fields began on a Monday and ran into immediate trouble by Wednesday. The soil composition in the lower section was different from what the surface readings had suggested, a clay-heavy layer that would redirect water the wrong direction without significant modification. Benjamin identified the problem first thing in the morning and came to find Eleanor where she was meeting with 2 tenant farmers about the harvest schedule. He waited at a respectful distance until she finished. She appreciated that. "How bad?" she asked when she came to him. "Not catastrophic," he said, "but it means another week of work and a different approach. I want to show you something." He had a rough diagram sketched on a piece of folded paper. He spread it on the fence post between them and walked her through the revised plan. A deeper channel in the northwest corner. A redirected flow path. 2 additional drainage points she hadn't originally mapped. She studied it carefully. "This section here," she pointed. "That's the edge of the Garrett family's rented land. We'd need to involve them in the decision. The channel will run through their field for about 40 yards. "I didn't know whose land that was," Benjamin admitted. "I'll talk to them," she said. She folded the diagram and tucked it into the pocket of her work apron. "Give me until tomorrow morning." She went to the Garrett farm that afternoon herself on foot because the cart was in use and she wasn't inclined to wait. Thomas Garrett was 60 years old and had worked Carter land his entire adult life. He met her with the same mixture of wariness and careful respect that most tenants showed her now, a respect she had earned, not inherited. She explained the drainage situation, plainly showed him the diagram, and told him exactly what the new channel would mean for his field, the temporary disruption, the long-term benefit, the additional moisture management it would provide for his lower planting rows. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "My father worked this land before me, Mrs. Carter. 40 years, and not once did anyone from the manor come to ask what we thought about anything." "I'm asking," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Do it," he said. "And thank you for coming in person." She was back at the manor by supper time with the Garrett agreement in hand and a clear path forward for the drainage project. She passed through the front hall and found Nathaniel standing near the bottom of the staircase with his coat still on, as though he had just come in himself. He looked at her, at the dirt on her boots, at the rolled diagram she carried, at the particular set of her shoulders that came from a day of purposeful work. "You went to the Garrett farm," he said. "Their land is involved in the drainage modification," she replied. "They deserve to know. I could have sent the overseer." "I know you could have." She moved past him toward the stairs. "I thought it was important enough to go myself." She felt him watching her as she climbed. She did not turn around. That night at dinner, the first dinner in several weeks, where neither of them had a reason to leave early, the silence lasted through the soup course before Nathaniel set down his spoon and looked at her directly. "Thomas Garrett stopped me in the village 3 weeks ago," he said. "He told me his family would have lost the farm without the rental restructuring you arranged." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I know. He said you came to his house yourself, sat at their table." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" She considered the question carefully. "Would it have changed anything if I had?" The question landed harder than she had intended it to. She watched him absorb it. Watched something move across his face that was neither defensiveness nor dismissal. Something quieter than both of those. "I don't know," he said honestly. She respected that answer more than she would have respected a denial. "The Garrett drainage agreement is on your desk," she said. "Benjamin will proceed tomorrow. We should see measurable improvement in that field's yield by next summer." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "All right." She returned to her meal. He returned to his. But the silence afterward was different, thinner somehow, as though something that had been very solid between them had begun almost imperceptibly to develop a crack. She did not allow herself to feel anything about that yet. She had learned the hard way that cracks could be repaired or widened, and she had no way of knowing yet which direction this one would go. The first real test came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in August, when Eleanor arrived at the schoolhouse to deliver the new reading primers she had ordered from Philadelphia, and found Miss Fenn in tears outside the door. She stopped the cart. "What's happened?" Miss Fenn was 24 and very earnest, and not yet experienced enough to hide distress efficiently. "The alderman," she managed. "He came this morning. He said he said it isn't a proper institution, that it hasn't been formally registered with the county. He's threatening to close it." Eleanor set down the box of primers she had been carrying. "Who is the alderman in this district?" "Mr. Corbin Voss," Miss Fenn said. "He's been trying to consolidate the county schools for 2 years. They say he has investors who want to build a fee-paying academy instead." Eleanor was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Go inside. Teach your lesson. Don't tell the children anything is wrong." "But Mrs. Carter, if he comes back..." "If he comes back, send someone to the manor." She picked up the primers again. "I'll handle Mr. Voss." She handled Mr. Voss by going directly to the county record office that afternoon and reviewing the school registration requirements herself. She spent 3 hours in a stuffy back room reading through county ordinances and educational statutes, while a bored clerk watched her with ill-concealed surprise. She found what she needed. The school was technically unregistered, which was accurate, But the ordinance also specified that any school providing free education to more than 6 children on land owned by a county landowner of record was exempt from the standard registration fee and could be formally designated a community institution with a single petition signed by 10 county residents in good standing. She had 10 signatures by the following morning. She could have gotten 30. People in Carter Valley signed their names to Eleanor Carter's petition. The way they did most things, she asked of them quickly and without hesitation, because she had spent the past months earning exactly that kind of trust. She filed the paperwork herself. She did not ask Nathaniel to use his political connections. She did not need to. The school was officially designated a community institution of Carter Valley by the end of the week. Mr. Corbin Voss wrote a stiff letter of acknowledgement that she read once and filed without response. Benjamin heard about it from one of the field workers and came to find her that afternoon while she was checking the progress of the drainage channel. "I heard you outmaneuvered a county alderman," he said. There was no flattery in his voice, just the plain appreciation of someone who found competence genuinely satisfying to observe. "I read the ordinance," she said. He was relying on the fact that no one else had. Most people wouldn't have thought to. She looked at the drainage channel. Most people haven't had 5 years to learn what happens when you leave problems unexamined. Benjamin was quiet for a moment. He understood she thought that she wasn't talking about county ordinances anymore. He had that quality, a kind of attentive intelligence, that caught the real meaning beneath the surface meaning, and it made conversations with him feel like actual exchanges rather than performances. "The orchard slope is ready for the first assessment," he said, shifting naturally. "I'd like your input before I finalize the variety recommendations." "Tomorrow morning," she said, "early before the heat." They went the next morning at 6 when the air still had the night's coolness in it and the south slope was golden with early light. Benjamin had brought his survey notes. Eleanor had brought her own observations, years of watching that hillside, tracking where the snow melted first in winter, where the soil held moisture longest in dry August. They worked through the slope, methodically discussing rootstock varieties, spacing the layout that would make the most of the natural drainage. Benjamin proposed. Eleanor questioned. She pushed back on 2 of his recommendations based on what she had observed about the soil's behavior in different seasons, and he listened to her objections carefully and revised his approach. "You've been watching this land for a long time," he said. "Since my first summer here," she confirmed. "Did you always know it could be an orchard?" She thought about it. "I always hoped it could be. There's a difference." She looked out across the slope. Hoping something is possible and knowing how to make it happen are different things. You gave me the second part. You gave yourself the second part, Benjamin said. I just confirmed what you already suspected. She turned to look at him. He was being entirely sincere. No maneuvering, no flattery, just the plain statement of a man who gave credit where it was due. She felt the unexpected sting of it somewhere behind her sternum. In 5 years of marriage, her husband had never once said anything like that to her. She looked away before the thought could go any further and turned back to the survey notes. Let's finalize the northeast section, she said. They were still there when Nathaniel arrived. She heard his horse before she saw him, the particular rhythm of Galahad's canter on the soft ground of the south path. He came around the stand of elms at the field's edge and stopped when he saw them, and for a moment nobody moved. Eleanor turned to face him. Nathaniel, I didn't know you were back from the village. Clearly, he said. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. Benjamin straightened. Mr. Carter, we're finalizing the orchard assessment. Your wife's observations about the soil patterns here have substantially improved the plan. You have a remarkable piece of land. Nathaniel looked at Benjamin for a moment, then at Eleanor, then back at the slope. The orchard was Eleanor's idea, he said. It came out slightly rough, like a man who had just understood something and wasn't certain how to hold it. Yes, Benjamin said simply. It was. Nathaniel nodded, once tightly turned his horse and rode back toward the manor. Eleanor watched him go. She kept her expression composed. She had long practice at that. but something about the way he had said her name, Eleanor's idea with the particular weight of a man acknowledging something he should have acknowledged long ago, caught somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She turned back to the survey notes. "Shall we continue?" she said. "Of course," Benjamin replied. He did not comment on what had just happened. She appreciated that too. The mini-climate in Carter Valley that August was unusual. A dry spell that should have broken by the second week of the month lingered instead through the third, shriveling the unirrigated crops and forcing every farmer in the valley to make hard decisions about water allocation. Eleanor had seen it coming 3 weeks earlier, when the creek levels began dropping faster than seasonal norms. She had spoken with Benjamin and begun prioritizing the estate's well usage accordingly. She had also quietly opened Carter Manor's secondary water access to 3 tenant farms that shared the eastern well, none of which had the legal right to that water under their current rental agreements. She did it without asking permission. When Nathaniel found out from the overseer, not from her, he came to her study that evening with the particular posture of a man who had prepared a response and then found that his preparation had been for a different conversation. "You extended water access to the Hatch-Garrett and Fielding farms," he said. "Yes." She was writing. She did not stop. "Without consulting me. You were in Pittsburgh." She set down her pen and looked at him. The Fielding children were drinking from the creek. Their primary well was running dry. "I made a decision." He stood in the doorway. "It's a matter of contract, Eleanor. Whatever the situation, I have a legal—" Their children were drinking creek water in a drought, Nathaniel. Her voice was steady. Not angry. Something quieter and more definitive than anger. "I will not apologize for preventing illness on your land because of a contract technicality." He was silent. "If you want to formally revise the water agreements," she continued, "I've already drafted 3 options. They're on your desk. All of them would extend access legally going forward and protect the estate's liability. I recommend option 2. She picked up her pen. "But I would have done what I did regardless." Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, "Which well is the Fielding family using?" She looked up. "The secondary eastern well near the elm stand. I'll have the overseer check the pump mechanism this week," he said. "It should have been serviced 2 months ago." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you." He nodded once and left. She stared at the doorway for a long time after he had gone. Something was changing. She wasn't sure yet what it was or what to do about it, or whether doing anything about it was wise. But she felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive in the pressure of the air in some instinct older than reason. She was not going to do anything rash. She was not going to feel things she had already finished feeling. But she noted it, filed it carefully, and returned to her work. The 3rd week of August brought a visitor Eleanor had not expected. Margaret Corley arrived in a private carriage from Philadelphia on a Thursday afternoon, elegant, composed, and possessed of the particular beauty that comes from both good genetics and significant expenditure. She was 30 years old, the widow of a wealthy merchant, and had been, Eleanor learned from Aunt Abigail that same evening, a significant figure in Nathaniel's life some years before his marriage. Abigail delivered this information over tea with the directness of someone who believed that known enemies were always preferable to unknown ones. "She was his companion for nearly 2 years, Abigail said calmly, before his political aspirations made the relationship inconvenient for both parties. She married Corley shortly after. He died 18 months ago. Eleanor received this information without visible reaction. "Why is she here?" she asked. "She claims it's a social call. She has family in Pittsburgh." Abigail set down her cup. "My opinion, for whatever it's worth, is that she has heard about Nathaniel's growing political profile and made certain calculations." "And Nathaniel?" Abigail looked at her steadily. "He is being very correct and very careful. But Margaret Corley was always skilled at making men feel remembered." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Of course." Abigail paused. "What will you do?" Eleanor looked at her tea. "Nothing," she said. "I will do absolutely nothing. Abigail studied her with those sharp, perceptive eyes. Nothing is sometimes the most powerful thing. That's what I'm counting on, Eleanor said. Dinner that evening was the most interesting meal Eleanor had sat through in months. Margaret Corley was charming in the way that very practiced people are charming effortlessly, specifically with impeccable timing. She addressed Nathaniel with a warmth that stopped just short of familiar. She spoke to Eleanor with the careful graciousness of a woman who is taking her measure. Eleanor spoke to her with perfect hospitality and said almost nothing of substance. She talked about the orchard project. She talked about the tenant farm drainage system. She talked about Miss Fenn's school and the county registration process. She did it without urgency, without performance, simply as a person describing work that mattered to her. She watched Margaret Corley's eyes move between her and Nathaniel as she spoke, recalculating, and she felt for the first time in months the small clarifying pleasure of being entirely underestimated. Nathaniel said very little during dinner, but several times Eleanor felt his attention shift toward her with a quality she could not quite name, something between assessment and something more complicated. After dinner, when Margaret had retired and Aunt Abigail had excused herself with transparent diplomacy, Eleanor rose to leave the dining room and found Nathaniel already standing. "The orchard," he said. "When do you expect the first trees to go in?" She paused. "Next spring, if the soil preparation goes well this fall." "I'd like to be involved," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without flinching. "All right," she said. She meant it as a provisional answer. He seemed to understand that. She left him there and went upstairs. She undressed, brushed out her hair, and sat at the small writing table beside her window for a long time before opening her notebook. The night was warm and heavy with the sounds of late summer. Somewhere below, she thought she could hear Nathaniel in the garden, the occasional shift of boots on gravel, the silence of a man standing somewhere in the dark. She did not go to the window, but she did not write anything in the notebook either. She simply sat and breathed and reminded herself who she was and what she had decided, and why it still mattered even now with things shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated, even now with something stubborn and inconvenient beginning to move in her chest like water finding its way through the clay. Margaret Corley left for Pittsburgh 2 days later, citing family obligations, her departure announced at breakfast with perfect social smoothness. She pressed Eleanor's hand at the door of the carriage. "You have made something extraordinary of this valley, Mrs. Carter," she said, and her voice was entirely sincere. "I had not expected that." Eleanor met her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Corley." The carriage pulled away. Nathaniel stood beside Eleanor on the front steps. After a moment he said quietly, "She's right." Eleanor said nothing. "The valley," he clarified, unnecessarily. They both knew that. "I had good material to work with," she said. "Eleanor, I need to speak with Benjamin about the fall soil preparation," she said. She moved down the front steps before he could say whatever he had been about to say. "Excuse me." She felt his gaze on her back as she walked away. She was not running from him. She was simply not ready. There was a significant difference, and she was the only one who needed to understand it. It was Aunt Abigail who found her that evening on the back porch, watching the sun lower itself toward the tree line, in the particular gold and amber palette of a Pennsylvania August at close. "He tried to apologize to you today," Abigail said, settling into the chair beside her. "He said 4 words," Eleanor replied. "That's not an apology." "No?" Abigail agreed. "It's a beginning." She paused. "Give him a little time, Eleanor. He's learning something he should have known from the start, and those lessons are always slower because of the pride that has to be dismantled first." "I know. You don't have to forgive anything you're not ready to forgive. I'm not asking that. I know that too." Eleanor watched the light change over the tree line. "I'm not angry anymore, Aunt Abigail. That's what surprises me. I thought what I felt was anger, but I think it was grief." She paused. "And grief is different. Grief doesn't need an apology to begin healing. It just needs time." Abigail reached over and covered Eleanor's hand with her own. She didn't say anything. She was a woman who knew when words were surplus. They sat together as the evening came in, and the fireflies began their quiet signaling in the grass below the porch and somewhere behind them. In the house, Nathaniel Carter was learning slowly and too late, and not yet nearly enough, what it meant to be married to a woman he had never properly seen. The letter from Harrisburg arrived on a Tuesday morning in the last week of August, and Eleanor happened to be in the front hallway when Mrs. Pruitt brought it in from the post. She could not have known what it contained. She had no reason to look at it twice. It was addressed to Nathaniel in an official hand, sealed with what appeared to be a legislative office mark, and she set it on the hall table with the rest of the morning correspondence and thought nothing more about it. By noon, Nathaniel had read it 3 times. By supper, he had not come to the table. She found him in his study at 7 o'clock, standing at the window with the letter in his hand, and when she knocked at the open door and he turned toward her, she saw something in his face that she had never seen there before in 5 years of marriage. Fear. "What's happened?" she asked. He held the letter out to her without speaking. She crossed the room and took it. She read it once quickly, then again carefully. A formal notice from the State Legislative Oversight Committee. An allegation submitted by an unnamed source that Nathaniel Carter had illegally acquired parcels of public land during the Boundary Survey Commission of 1811 land that had since generated significant revenue. The committee was opening a formal investigation. He was to appear before county officials within 60 days to provide documentation. The matter had already been mentioned in at least one Harrisburg newspaper. She read it a 3rd time. Then she looked up at him. "Did you do it?" she asked. The question hung between them. It was the only question that mattered, and they both knew it. He looked at her directly. "No." She held his gaze for a long moment, searching, quiet, deciding. She had lived with this man for 5 years. She knew his silences and his evasions and the particular quality of his voice when he was managing rather than telling. This was not that. "All right," she said. "Eleanor, I believe you," she said. "Now sit down. We need to figure out who submitted this and what documentation you actually have, because 60 days is not very long, and whoever did this chose the timing very deliberately." He stared at her. "Sit down, Nathaniel," she said again. She moved to the desk, set the letter down between them, and pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer. She picked up his pen. "Start from 1811, she said. "Tell me everything you remember about the Boundary Survey Commission." He sat down, and for the first time in 5 years of marriage, Nathaniel Carter looked at his wife across his own desk and understood with a clarity that arrived too late to be anything but painful that she was not only his equal. She might very well be the only person in Pennsylvania capable of saving him. She worked through the night, not because Nathaniel asked her to. He hadn't asked her for anything. He had sat across from her in stunned, careful silence while she wrote down everything he told her about the 1811 Boundary Survey Commission. Every name, every date, every parcel of land. He remembered being present for the documentation of. She had filled 4 pages before midnight and 6 before 2 in the morning, and somewhere around the 3rd hour, Nathaniel had gotten up and poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked, and set one beside her hand without comment. She had drunk it without looking up. By 3 in the morning, she had a working map of the problem. The allegation was specific 3 parcels in the southwestern corner of the county land that had been designated public reserve during the 1809 territorial survey, and had apparently been reclassified and transferred to Carter estate records in 1812. On paper, it looked deliberate. On paper, it looked exactly like what someone had designed it to look like. Who had access to the Survey Commission records in 1812? She asked. Nathaniel had his elbows on the desk and his hands pressed against his face. He lowered them. "The county clerk's office, the legislative surveyor, my land agent at the time, Hargrove. He handled the documentation for the estate transfers that year." "Where is Hargrove now?" "He left my employ in 1813, went to work for a competing land interest in Ohio. We did not part on good terms." Eleanor looked at him steadily. How bad were those terms? I refused to sign a contract he had negotiated without my authorization. He had committed the estate to a land purchase I hadn't approved. I terminated his position the same day. Did he threaten you? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Not in words. She wrote the name down and underlined it twice. I need access to the original 1811 survey documents, she said, not the estate copies. The originals filed with the county. And I need the 1812 transfer records from the clerk's office, the actual registration documents, not the summaries. The clerk's office is in Connellsville, Nathaniel said. I know where it is. Eleanor, the committee is based in Harrisburg. If this goes before a legislative panel, it won't get to a legislative panel, she said. She set down the pen and looked at him directly. Not if we find the original documents first and establish what actually happened in 1812. Someone altered records or fabricated a transfer. That kind of forgery leaves traces if you know where to look. She paused. Do you trust me to look? The question sat in the air between them. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of him looking past her. 5 years of her doing the invisible work that kept everything around them functioning while he occupied himself with the visible world. He looked at her, now really looked the way she had wanted him to look at her for years, and said yes. It was one word. It landed like a stone in still water. Get some sleep, she said. She gathered her notes. I'm leaving for Connellsville at first light. She was in the carriage before 6 with her notebook, her documented analysis, and a cold biscuit she had taken from the kitchen because she hadn't bothered with breakfast. Benjamin met her at the stable as she was leaving. He had heard the carriage being prepared and come to investigate. Trouble, he asked. She told him briefly. His expression changed as she spoke, not with alarm, but with the focused attention of someone who understood the stakes. What do you need from me? He asked. Keep the fieldwork moving. Don't let anyone know there's a problem at the manor. And if anyone from a newspaper or a government office comes asking questions about Mr. Carter before I return. She met his eyes. Tell them he's unavailable and refer them to the household directly. Understood. He paused. Be careful, Mrs. Carter. Always, she said. It wasn't entirely true, but it was the right thing to say. The clerk's office in Connellsville was managed by a small, precise man named Hendricks, who wore his authority over his file cabinets like a personal kingdom. He looked at Eleanor over the top of his spectacles when she explained what she needed, and made the face of a man about to explain why things weren't possible. She set Nathaniel's official legislative authorization on his desk before he could speak. He picked it up. Read it. Set it back down. The 1811 survey records, she said, and the 1812 transfer registrations for parcels in the southwestern county sections. I'll need the originals, not the ledger copies. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up and went to the back room. He was gone for 22 minutes. She counted. When he returned, he had 3 bound record books and a separate folder of loose documents. He set them on the counter with the particular reverence of a man for whom paper was sacred. I'll need the reading room, she said. She spent 4 hours with those records. She was methodical. She had learned to read legal and financial documents at her father's knee. Judge Harlan Whitmore, for all his failures, had believed his daughter should understand how the world actually operated, and he had taught her to read the language of official records the way other fathers taught their sons. She went through the 1811 survey line by line, cross-referencing against the 1812 transfer registrations, building a chronology in her notebook, with the patience of someone who understood that truth in paperwork was always in the details that didn't quite align. She found it in the 3rd hour. The 1812 transfer document for the southwestern parcels bore the county clerk's registration stamp, but the stamp's ink saturation was different from every other document filed in that same month. Slightly darker, slightly more precise. The kind of difference that occurred when a stamp was applied to a document that had not been present when the others were processed. When she compared the registration number sequence, the southwestern parcel transfers were numbered out of order, logged as though they had been filed on March 14, 1812, but carrying registration numbers that should have been assigned in late April. Someone had backdated the filing. Someone had created the appearance of a legal transfer that had never actually occurred using a stamp that had either been stolen or replicated and inserted it into the county record with just enough surface authenticity to survive casual examination. Her hand was perfectly steady as she wrote it all down. She requested copies of 3 specific pages from Hendricks, paid the copying fee from her own purse, thanked him with composed politeness, and walked out to the carriage. She sat inside for exactly 2 minutes before she allowed herself to exhale. She had it. Not everything she still needed the Hargrove connection established, still needed to trace where the forged stamp had come from. But she had enough to demonstrate that the transfer documents were fraudulent, and that changed the entire nature of the investigation. Nathaniel hadn't stolen public land. Someone had manufactured evidence to make it appear that he had. The question now was, why and who had the reach and the motive to do it? She was back at Carter Manor by early evening. Nathaniel met her in the front hall before she had removed her wrap. He looked like a man who had spent the day not sleeping, which was accurate. "Well," he said. She told him what she had found. She watched the sequence of reactions move across his face. Relief, then anger, then something sharper and more complicated. "Hargrove," he said. "Possibly. But he would have needed assistance inside the clerk's office or access to the stamp itself. This wasn't one person working alone." She opened her notebook to the relevant pages. "I need to trace the stamp, and I need to know who else has a significant interest in discrediting you politically right now. Who are your enemies in Harrisburg, Nathaniel? The real ones. Not the men who vote against you, the ones who need you gone." He was quiet for a moment. "Senator Greer," he said. The name landed in Eleanor's chest like a dropped stone. Senator Aldous Greer, the man who had been standing beside her husband at the harvest ball. The man who had listened to Nathaniel say that marrying her had been the price of protecting his family's future and had laughed. She kept her face entirely composed. "Tell me about Greer," she said. "He wants the southwestern land for a canal project. Has for 3 years. Several of those parcels." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "The ones I allegedly stole, they sit directly in the proposed canal corridor. If I'm removed from the Legislative Assembly on corruption charges, my land holdings go under review and possible seizure. The canal project gets its corridor, and Greer gets the commission." Eleanor looked at him. "He was at the harvest ball. He's always at the harvest ball. Half of Pennsylvania politics is conducted at social events." She nodded slowly. "I need to go to Harrisburg." "Absolutely not. It's a 3-day journey and I need to speak with the Legislative Surveyor's office directly," she said. The original 1811 commission documents were filed there, not at the county level. If the stamp was duplicated, there may be a record of when it was last used officially. That trail leads somewhere. She looked at him steadily. "I'm going, Nathaniel. You can argue about it after this is resolved." He opened his mouth, closed it. She had never heard him concede a point in silence before. It was, she thought, a form of progress. She left for Harrisburg 3 days later. She did not go alone. Mrs. Pruitt arranged for a second carriage and 2 of the Manor's most reliable men to travel with her. Benjamin, who had listened to the situation with characteristic careful attention, provided her with a letter of introduction to an agricultural colleague of his who worked near the Capitol and could provide reliable lodging. Nathaniel came to the carriage before she departed. He stood beside it for a moment, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who had several things to say and wasn't sure any of them were adequate. "Eleanor," he said. "I'll write when I have something," she replied. "That isn't, I wanted to say." He stopped. Tried again. "Be careful." She looked at him. He was not asking her to be careful the way you ask someone to take an umbrella. He was asking it with something raw, underneath something that had not been there 6 months ago, something she wasn't sure what to do with. "I will," she said. She meant it more carefully this time. Harrisburg in late August was loud and crowded and deeply self-important in the way of all political centers. The Legislative Surveyor's office was on the 2nd floor of a stone building that smelled of old paper and ambition. And the man who ran it, a thin, nervous clerk named Addison Pruitt, clearly had no idea what to do with a woman who arrived with official authorization, a documented anomaly in county registration records, and the particular composure of someone who had already decided how this conversation was going to go. She was in his office for 90 minutes. She came out with two things: confirmation that the registration stamp for southwestern county parcels had been reported missing from the county office for a 3-week period in early 1812, and a record of the formal complaint that had been filed about it filed, and then inexplicably closed without resolution 2 weeks later by a senior official whose name she did not recognize. She looked up the name that night in Benjamin's colleague's library. The official was a deputy commissioner who had retired in 1813 with a modest government pension and had since acquired a very comfortable property in Western Virginia that was by any reasonable calculation significantly beyond what a deputy commissioner's pension could support. She sat with that information for a long time. Then she wrote 4 letters to Nathaniel, to a lawyer in Philadelphia she had identified through the county registration research, to a retired judge she had located through her father's old professional network, and to a woman named Clara Whitfield, who had been the wife of the original 1811 Survey Commission chairman, and who was, according to everything Eleanor had been able to determine, still alive and living in a farmhouse outside the capital. She sent the letters the next morning. Clara Whitfield's reply arrived within 24 hours, which told Eleanor everything she needed to know about whether the woman had been waiting for someone to ask. They met at a tea house near the river on a Thursday morning. Clara Whitfield was 63, spare and direct, with the eyes of someone who had watched something wrong happen and had been carrying it ever since. "I wondered if anyone would ever come," Clara said when Eleanor had explained why she was there. "What did you see?" Eleanor asked. Clara wrapped both hands around her teacup. "My husband served on that 1811 commission honestly. He was a careful man. He noted every parcel, every designation in the official record. He came home one evening in March of 1812, very troubled, wouldn't say exactly what, but said there was something irregular in the county filing that hadn't been there when he'd last reviewed it." She paused. "He was dead of a fever by June. I always thought it was a fever." The words sat in the air between them. "You're not sure it was a fever?" Eleanor said quietly. Clara met her eyes. "I'm sure I was told it was. I'm less sure of what to believe about things I was simply told." She reached into her bag and produced a small leather-bound book. "He kept a personal record alongside the official one. He always did. When he died, I put it away. I wasn't sure what it meant. I'm still not entirely sure." She set it on the table between them. Eleanor looked at it. She did not reach for it immediately. "Are you willing for this to be used as evidence?" she asked. "If it comes to a formal proceeding, your name will be attached to it." Clara Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "My husband deserved better than what he got," she said. "So did anyone else caught up in whatever that business was." She pushed the book slightly closer. "Take it, Mrs. Carter." Eleanor took it. She read it in the carriage on the way back to Benjamin's colleague's house, the afternoon light shifting through the window as the pages revealed themselves a careful, thorough, honest man's account of a commission that had functioned correctly until something or someone had interfered with it. The southwestern parcels were listed in the chairman's personal record, exactly as they should have been designated public reserve. No transfer authorized, no change of status. The county record that showed otherwise was a fabrication, and now she could prove it. She was 2 hours from the manor, 2 hours into the 3-day return journey, stopped at a crossing inn while the horses were watered when the river happened. She had known the Cassidy Creek crossing was running high. The innkeeper had mentioned it briefly with the offhand warning of a man who didn't think it was his problem. She had calculated the time and the necessity and made a decision. The carriage made the crossing. She did not. Not because the carriage failed, it didn't. It was the approach on foot she had chosen, stepping out to check the depth herself before committing the horses that put her in the water when the bank gave way beneath her weight without warning. The current was faster than it looked, the way water always is. She went in hard and sideways, and for approximately 40 seconds, the Cassidy Creek had complete authority over her. She did not lose the satchel with the documents. She held it above her head by pure instinct and stubbornness, while she fought the current with her other hand, and her feet found purchase on the rocky bottom, and she hauled herself toward the bank with everything she had. She came out of the water 30 yards downstream, soaked through with a long cut along her forearm from a submerged branch, and the satchel still in her raised hand. The men traveling with her reached her within moments. She was already standing. "The documents are dry," she said, before anyone could ask anything else. They looked at her with the particular expression of people who had just watched something alarming and weren't sure yet how alarmed to be. "Ma'am," one of them said carefully. "I'm all right," she said. "Get the carriage across. I need dry clothes and we can continue." They continued. She arrived at Carter Manor on a Saturday evening, 2 days later than planned, with dried mud on her boots, a bandaged forearm, and the leather satchel intact. Nathaniel was in the front drive when the carriage came through the gate. He had been watching for it. She could tell from the way he was standing, the particular tension of a man who had been waiting longer than he wanted to admit. When she stepped down from the carriage, he looked at the bandage on her arm, and something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Not concern. Not the polite surface-level concern of a man performing appropriate husbandly attention. Something real. Something that cost him something to feel. "What happened?" he said. It came out flat because he was controlling it hard. "River crossing," she said. "The bank gave way. I'm fine. You're—" He stopped. He looked at her arm again, at her face, at the satchel she was carrying. He said nothing for a long moment. "Come inside." He walked beside her to the house, not ahead of her, not behind her, beside her, and held the door. She went straight to his study. She set the satchel on his desk, opened it, and laid out everything she had found. The copied county records with the anomalous stamp, the legislative surveyor's report of the missing stamp, the deputy commissioner's suspicious retirement finances, Clara Whitfield's account, and her husband's personal record of the 1811 commission. She walked him through all of it methodically, the way she had walked him through the household audit in her kitchen notebook months ago. He listened without interrupting. His expression moved through several things she was watching carefully, understanding anger, something harder and colder, as the full shape of the conspiracy became clear. "Greer," he said when she finished. "Almost certainly. But Greer needed the deputy commissioner's cooperation to bury the missing stamp report in 1812, which means this has been planned for a very long time. They didn't manufacture this accusation recently, Nathaniel. They laid the groundwork 3 years ago and waited for the right moment to use it. The canal project," he said. "The funding vote is in December. If I'm discredited before then, you won't be." She closed the satchel. "I need you to arrange a meeting with the county officials as soon as possible. Formal, documented, with your lawyer present. We bring everything: the evidence of forgery, the commission chairman's personal record, the stamp discrepancy. We don't give them time to prepare a counter-argument." She looked at him. "Can you convene something within the week?" "Within 3 days," he said. He was already thinking operationally. She could see it, the political machinery of his mind engaging with the problem. He knew how these proceedings worked. He knew which officials could be trusted and which couldn't, and how to structure a presentation to a county panel. That was his competence, as hers had been the research. 3 days, she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said. "The river, it doesn't matter." "It does matter." His voice was different, lower, not managed. "You nearly—" He stopped himself, tried again. "You had no reason to take that risk for me." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't do it for you," she said. And it was true in the most important way. She had done it for the farmers who needed Carter Valley's stability, for Miss Fenn's school, for the orchard that was going to cover that south hillside in 5 years' time, for everything she had built here that she refused to let a corrupt senator dismantle. "I did it for this valley." He held her gaze. He knew that was partly true. She could see him knowing it, and knowing the rest of it too, the part she wasn't saying. "Thank you," he said, quietly, without qualification or performance. She nodded once. "Get your lawyer here by Monday," she said. "I have letters to write tonight." She went to the door. She was almost through it when he spoke again. "Aunt Abigail told me," he said, "about the Cassidy Creek. One of the men sent word ahead." She turned. "I want you to know," he said, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man dismantling something he'd spent years constructing, "that if anything had happened to you, I would not have recovered from it." The words were too careful to be practiced, too exposed to be strategic. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "I know," she said. And she left. She sat in her room for a long time that night without lighting the lamp. She had been so certain for so many months that she had finished feeling things where Nathaniel Carter was concerned. She had done the work of detachment so thoroughly, so deliberately, that she had believed it was complete. She had told herself that what she had was clarity. That clarity was better than hope, that a woman who had stopped needing approval was finally free. She was still free. That part was true. But freedom, she was learning, did not mean the absence of feeling. It meant the ability to feel something without being destroyed by it. It meant being able to stand in a doorway and hear a man's voice break over 4 words and feel the impact of it without losing anything she had become. She was not the same woman who had pressed her hand against a ballroom wall and held her breath while her husband described their marriage as a price paid. She was someone new. Someone who had crossed a flooded river with documents held above her head and come out the other side intact. Whatever came next, whatever Nathaniel was or wasn't, whatever he felt or was learning to feel, she would meet it as herself. That she thought was the only way anything real could begin. The county meeting took place on a Wednesday morning in the first week of September. Eleanor sat in the second row of the county hall. She had not been asked to speak. The formal proceeding was between Nathaniel, his lawyer, and the county panel. She understood that and she respected it. But she had prepared every document that went onto that table. She had flagged every relevant page. She had written the summary analysis that the lawyer read verbatim from, because it was, as he had said privately to Nathaniel that morning, the clearest presentation of the evidence he had seen in 20 years of practice. She watched the panel review the documents. She watched the chairman's expression change when he reached the stamp discrepancy analysis, the moment when a man who has been looking at a manufactured accusation realizes visibly that he is looking at a manufactured accusation. She watched Nathaniel present himself with the controlled, steady authority that was natural to him, not defensive, not pleading, simply certain. A man who had nothing to hide and documents to prove it. The panel deliberated for 40 minutes. They returned a finding of no credible evidence to support the allegations. Nathaniel's name was formally cleared. The room exhaled. She heard people around her speak congratulations, relief, the particular noise of a crisis moving from present to past. She sat still for a moment before rising. Nathaniel crossed the room toward her through the small crowd. He was speaking to people as he moved brief, composed acknowledgments, but his eyes were on her. He stopped in front of her. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she agreed. Around them, people were talking, rearranging themselves, moving toward the doors. No one was paying particular attention to the two of them, a husband and wife standing close together in a county hall in the first week of September, in the quiet that follows the ending of one thing and the uncertain beginning of something else. "I owe you more than I can calculate," he said. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it. She looked at him steadily. The man she saw was different from the one she had married. Not in his face, not in the way he stood. In the way he looked at her, like she was a person. Like she was the person. Like he had finally, at considerable cost to his pride, and with no particular right to expect grace, arrived at the understanding he should have had from the beginning. She was not ready to give him everything. Trust rebuilt the way soil repaired slowly, seasonally, not through a single event, but through 100 consistent ones. But she was willing, she thought, to let the process begin. "You can start," she said carefully, "by coming with me to inspect the orchard slope this weekend. Benjamin's planting recommendations are finalized. I want your opinion on the layout before we commit to the spacing." Something shifted in his face, something that had been locked for a very long time. "I'll be there," he said. She believed him. That was for now enough. He was there. Saturday morning, 6 o'clock before the heat settled in. Eleanor came around the side of the manor toward the south path and found Nathaniel already waiting at the edge of the orchard slope, with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding Benjamin's planting diagram in both hands and studying it with the focused attention of a man who intended to understand something rather than simply appear to. She stopped for a half-second before he noticed her. She had not expected that. She had expected him to be late or to arrive with the polished punctuality of a man performing effort rather than making it. She had not expected him to be early and genuinely engaged and already asking Benjamin a question about soil depth when she arrived. Benjamin saw her first and nodded. Nathaniel turned. "You're up early," she said. "I wanted to understand the diagram before you got here," he said. "I had questions." He held it up. "Benjamin's been explaining the rootstock logic. I think I understand it now." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took the diagram from his hands and oriented it toward the slope. "Walk me through what you understand," she said. He did. Imperfectly. At first he conflated two of the variety sections in the northeast corner, but he caught his own error before she corrected it and asked Benjamin the right question to clarify. She watched him take in the answer and recalibrate and proceed. He was not a man who learned slowly. He had simply never bothered to learn this before. They walked the entire slope that morning, all three of them. Nathaniel asked more questions than she expected and offered two observations about the northwest drainage that were, she had to acknowledge, genuinely useful. He had been riding this land since boyhood and knew the seasonal water behavior in the lower field from decades of direct experience. She incorporated both observations into the revised spacing plan. By the time they came back up the slope, the morning had stretched toward midday, and the heat had arrived in earnest. Benjamin excused himself to check on the field crew. Eleanor and Nathaniel stood at the top of the slope alone, looking down at what was going to become in 5 or 6 years, with patience and consistent attention, something extraordinary. "I owe you an apology," Nathaniel said. She had been expecting it. She had been dreading it slightly because apologies required responses, and she was not yet certain what her response should be. "You don't need to." "I do." His voice was even, but it had that quality she had noticed more often recently, the quality of a man speaking from somewhere unmanaged. "Not for the investigation. For the 5 years before it." He paused. "For what I said at the harvest ball." She went very still. "You heard," he said. It was not a question. "I heard," she confirmed. The silence between them was the most honest thing that had existed in their marriage since the beginning of it. "There is no adequate apology for that," he said. "I know that. I'm not offering you adequate. I'm offering you true." He turned to look at her directly. "What I said to Greer that night was contemptible. It was also false in every way that matters. I told myself for years that the marriage was a practical arrangement because it was easier than admitting that I had been given something I didn't know how to value." He paused. "That was a failure of character. Mine, not yours." Eleanor looked at the slope, at the future orchard that existed right now only as potential soil and sunlight and possibility. "Why were you the way you were?" she asked, not accusingly, genuinely. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I trusted someone completely once, before you. A woman I intended to marry. She used what I told her things I had never told anyone to benefit her family's financial position at the expense of mine, publicly." He paused. "I decided after that to never be in that position again, to never let anyone close enough to damage me." "So you built a wall," she said. "I built a wall," he agreed. "And then I put you on the outside of it and called it a reasonable arrangement and told myself you were content." His voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. "I knew you weren't content. I just found it easier not to look directly at that." She turned to face him. "I'm not that woman," she said. "I was never that woman. I know that now." "You knew it then," she said. "You simply chose not to act on what you knew." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying that to wound you, Nathaniel. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think we have to be honest with each other now, or none of this means anything." He absorbed that without deflecting. "You're right," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He stood there and let her look. No performance, no management, no careful positioning. Just a man who had dismantled something he'd spent years building and was standing in the space where it used to be. "I'm not ready to trust you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. What happened between us, what didn't happen, that doesn't resolve in a morning on a hillside. I know, but I'm willing to let you try to earn it," she said. "If you're willing to earn it in the way things are actually earned, not with gestures, not with grand statements." She paused. "With consistency, over time." He nodded, slowly, like a man who understood exactly what that meant and was not going to diminish it by responding too quickly. "All right," he said. She turned back toward the manor. "Come to the Garrett farm with me Tuesday morning," she said over her shoulder. "Thomas wants to discuss the fall planting schedule, and I need someone who actually knows the Northwest field history firsthand." "I'll be there," he said. She believed him again. That belief was she was learning a fragile and important thing, not to be given freely, but not to be withheld from evidence either. He had been there Saturday. He said he would be there Tuesday. She would see. He was there Tuesday. He was there every time after that. He came to the Garrett farm and sat across from Thomas Hatch at a tenant's table, the way Eleanor had done, not as the lord of the land dropping in to be seen, but as a man who had come to listen. Thomas was initially wary. Thomas had spent too many years being looked through to trust that he was being looked at. But Nathaniel asked him questions about the Northwest field history and actually waited for the answers, and by the end of the visit, Thomas was talking about his father's observations of the water table with the ease of a man who had been storing up that knowledge for someone worth telling. On the way back from the Garrett farm, Nathaniel said, "I didn't know the Northwest field flooded in 1801. That would have been before I took over management of the estate. My father never mentioned it." "Thomas mentioned it to me in our first conversation," Eleanor said. "Last October." He was quiet. "He mentioned it to me," she repeated gently, "because I asked him about the field. People will tell you everything they know, Nathaniel, if you ask them, and then actually listen." He did not respond immediately. She watched him absorbing it, not defensively, not with the reflex resistance of someone protecting a position, simply taking it in. "I'm beginning to understand that," he said. He came with her to Miss Fenn's school the following week. He sat in the back of the room while Eleanor spoke with the children about the fall curriculum, and afterward, he donated his own money, not from the estate accounts, his personal money, to fund a second teacher for the expanding enrollment. He told no one about it except Eleanor, which she noticed. He did not do it to be seen doing it. He did it because he had seen what it meant. She noted every one of these things. She filed them carefully and let them accumulate. She was not grading him. She was watching for the thing that mattered, which was not whether he did good things, but whether the good things came from somewhere real, or whether they were still at some level performance. She was beginning to believe they were real. She was not certain, but she was beginning to believe. Benjamin Hale, for his part, observed all of this with the quiet intelligence that characterized him. He said nothing about what he saw. He did not withdraw. He continued his work on the estate with the same steady professionalism that had defined him from the beginning. But Eleanor noticed in small ways that he had understood what was shifting. He scheduled more of his consultations with Nathaniel directly. He deferred certain estate decisions that had previously been hers alone to the two of them together. He was creating space without being asked to. She appreciated it. He was a good man. She had been grateful for him. She hoped quietly that he would find his own orchard someday. The twist arrived the way real revelations always do, not in a dramatic moment staged for effect, but in a quiet conversation on an ordinary afternoon between two people in a sitting room with no audience and no preparation. Aunt Abigail had been ill for 3 days with a chest cold that the household had initially attributed to the changing season. By the 4th day, she was better, and sitting up and receiving visitors, which was a relief to everyone who had underestimated Abigail Carter's constitution once and did not intend to do so again. Eleanor visited her that Thursday afternoon with tea and a report on the orchard spacing finalization, which was the kind of practical news Abigail preferred over sympathy. They talked for an hour. It was one of those conversations that moves without effort from the orchard to the school to the political fallout from Greer's now exposed scheme, which had produced the kind of Harrisburg gossip that would keep several parlors occupied through the winter. Abigail was sharp and wry and entirely herself, which was deeply reassuring. Then, in the way that significant things happen, the conversation moved sideways. "I've been thinking," Abigail said, "about what you told me once, about how you came to be at Carter Manor." She paused. "Your father's property was in Pittsburgh before his difficulties, you said." "Yes," Eleanor replied. "We lived in Pittsburgh until I was 16. Near the river district, toward the eastern quarter. There was a mill creek that ran behind our property." Eleanor paused. "Why?" Abigail was looking at her with an expression Eleanor could not immediately read. "Nathaniel nearly drowned in a mill creek," she said slowly. "In the eastern quarter of Pittsburgh. He was 9 years old. His parents had taken him to visit a business contact, I remember, because his mother wrote me about it afterward. She said he would have died if a child hadn't pulled him out." She paused. "A girl," she said. "A girl who had been playing on the creek bank. She pulled him out and went for help, and by the time anyone came back to thank her properly, the child had gone home, and no one knew which family she belonged to." Eleanor set down her teacup. The sound it made against the saucer was very small and very clear. She was 9 years old in 1803. They had lived near the eastern mill creek. She had been, as her father had always put it, a child with absolutely no instinct for danger, and considerable instinct for water. She had spent half her summers in and around that creek. She remembered a boy. She had not thought about it in years. It was the kind of childhood memory that existed at the edges rather than the center, imprecise with time and distance. A boy who had fallen from the bank, the cold shock of the water, the way she had grabbed his arm because it was the only thing she knew how to do, dragging him to the shallower section near the bend, running for the mill worker she had seen upstream. She had not stayed. Her mother had strict instructions about strangers. She had gone home and told no one because she had also been somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. "Eleanor," Abigail said quietly. "How old was he?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was steady. Everything else was not. 9, Abigail said. It was the summer of 1803. The sitting room was very quiet. Eleanor thought about 5 years of marriage, about a man who had looked through her without seeing her, about a boy she had pulled from a mill creek when she was 9 years old, whose face she no longer remembered clearly, who had grown into the man she had married without either of them ever knowing. She thought about the night she had almost drowned in the Cassidy Creek, holding documents above her head to save him again. Not knowing that she had already saved his life once before without recognition or gratitude or any connection between the two events. She had saved him twice. She had loved the version of him she had hoped he might be, and he had not known any of it. "He doesn't know," she said. "No," Abigail said. "I'm not even certain until this moment. I've been turning it over since your description of where you lived. The timing, the location it matches." She paused. "I thought you should know before I said anything to him." Eleanor stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a long moment. She did not know precisely what she was feeling. It was too large and too complicated to have a clean name. There was something grief-shaped at the center of it. Grief for the years that might have been different if anyone had known grief for the 9-year-old girl who had done something brave and come home without being thanked. Grief for the irony that was almost too perfect to be bearable. And there was something else underneath the grief, something quieter and stranger, something that felt improbably like resolution. She had not saved him for a reason. She had saved him because he was a child in a creek and she was nearby, and she had not been able to do anything else. She had not loved him for a reason either. She had married him and tried to love him because he was her husband, and she believed somewhere deep and stubborn in herself that love was always worth attempting. That belief had been tested and had broken and had been rebuilt into something harder and more honest. None of it had been wasted, not a day of it. "Abigail," she said finally without turning from the window. "Does it change anything if I tell him?" "I think," Abigail said carefully, "that it might change everything. Not because of what it means about the past, but because of what it means about who you are to each other." She paused. "He needs to know Eleanor. Not so he can be grateful, so he can understand that the woman he dismissed was also the woman who had already, without knowing it, given him his life." Eleanor turned around. "I'll tell him," she said, "when the time is right, and not to give him anything, not as a gift or a leverage point or an emotional debt, as the truth." She paused. "He needs to hear it as the truth." "Yes," Abigail agreed. "He does." She went to find him that evening. He was in the barn, which surprised her. He had his coat on a post, and he was repairing a broken stall gate himself, not directing someone to do it, not waiting for the maintenance to be scheduled, just doing it the way she had seen him do. 3 or 4 physical things around the estate in the past weeks, with the quiet purposefulness of a man who had decided that the gap between himself and the actual work of the land needed closing. He looked up when she came in. He started to say something about the gate. She stopped him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something Abigail and I discussed this afternoon." He set down the tool he was holding. She told him. She told it plainly, without dramatics, the way she told him most things, the facts first, the implications after. The Mill Creek in Pittsburgh in 1803. The boy she had pulled out. The details that matched. The timing. She watched his face. She had seen Nathaniel Carter receive political attacks without expression change. She had seen him sit across from county officials who were questioning his integrity and maintain composed authority without a tremor. She had seen him manage fear and uncertainty and anger with the disciplined control of a man who had spent 30 years building walls. She had never seen him lose those walls entirely. Until now, he stood completely still. She could see him placing the pieces 9 years old, the Eastern Mill Creek, his mother's letter, the girl who had disappeared before anyone could find her. She could see it land. She could see it land in layers, the fact first, then the meaning, then the full weight of the meaning, and then something below the weight that had no name. His jaw moved. He didn't speak. "Nathaniel," she said quietly. He sat down on the stall gate he had been repairing. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the barn floor. "The Cassidy Creek," he said. His voice was something she had never heard from him before. Raw, unmanaged. "You nearly drowned in the Cassidy Creek carrying evidence to save me. And before that..." He stopped. "I didn't know," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I had no idea it was you. I wouldn't have kept that from you if I had known. I know you wouldn't." He looked up at her. There were no tears. He was not a man who cried easily, and she had not expected it. But there was something in his face that was more exposed than tears. Something that had been protected for 30 years by walls and distance and careful emotional management, and that was now simply present without armor, meeting her eyes directly. "I rejected the only woman who had already given me my life," he said. "Twice." "You didn't know either," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but it's a fact." He stood up. He crossed the barn toward her and stopped 2 feet away. She held her ground. She had learned in the past months that she could hold her ground against anything he had to offer, that the woman she had become was solid in a way the woman she had been had not yet been. She felt that solidity now. It did not make her cold. It made her clear. "I don't know what I deserve from you," he said. "I'm not going to pretend to know. But I want you to understand." He stopped himself. Chose his words with the care of a man who had said the wrong things too many times and intended this time to say the true ones. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known. You have been that from the beginning. and I wasted 5 years that I cannot give back to you, and I will carry that for the rest of my life." He paused. "I'm not saying this so you'll forgive me. I'm saying it so you'll know that I see you. Finally, completely without any reservation, I see you." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the ballroom, about the corridor, about the carriage ride home in the dark when she had made a quiet decision that had changed everything. She thought about the 14 months since that night, the accounts, the farms, the school, the orchard slope, the flooded river, the county hall, the barn. Everything she had built and fought for and refused to surrender. She was not the same woman who had walked out of that ball. She was better. She was harder and more honest and more fully herself than she had ever been. She would not trade those months for anything, not even for the pain that had produced them. "I know you see me," she said. "I've been watching you learn to." Something shifted in his expression. Something that might in a different man have been described as relief. In Nathaniel Carter, it was more complex than that. It was the particular release of a person who has been holding a truth for a long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. "Eleanor," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes. What would it take?" He held her gaze steadily. "Not forgiveness. I understand that's not the same conversation, and I'm not asking for it tonight. But what would it take to let me try?" She was quiet for a moment. "You already started," she said. "In September on the orchard slope. You've been trying for 2 months." She paused. "The question isn't what it would take. The question is whether you can continue, whether this is who you actually are now, or whether it's who you've decided to be for a season because of what happened. How will you know which one it is?" "Time," she said simply. "Same way you know anything real. Time and consistency and watching what a person does when it's inconvenient." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll give you time," he said. "However much you need." She moved toward the barn door, stopped, turned back. "The gate," she said, nodding at the stall. "You left it half finished." He looked at it. Something shifted in his face. Something that was almost a smile, caught and controlled before it fully arrived. "I'll finish it," he said. She left him there. She walked back across the yard toward the house in the early October evening, and the air smelled of turned earth and late apples and the particular clarity of a season in its final days. She could hear behind her the sounds of the barn wood and iron, a man's hands working something being repaired. The work of becoming someone different was not done in a single revelation. She knew that. He was learning it. You did not remake a marriage in a sitting room or a barn any more than you planted an orchard in an afternoon. You came back the next day and the day after that, and you kept coming, and eventually the thing you had been tending was something real. She was willing to tend it. She was not certain yet what it would grow into, but for the first time in 5 years, she was willing to find out. The letter from Senator Greer's office arrived the following week, not addressed to Nathaniel this time, but to Eleanor directly. It was stiff and formal, and buried its content in legal language, but its meaning was plain enough. Greer's faction was pursuing one final attempt to challenge the county panel's findings through a higher legislative appeal. They had 60 days to file. If they did, Nathaniel would be required to appear before a full legislative committee in Harrisburg. She read it twice, folded it, set it on Nathaniel's desk without comment. He read it that evening while she was working across the room. She heard the change in his breathing, the slight tightening, and waited. "He won't stop," Nathaniel said. "No," she agreed. "He won't. Not while the canal project is still financially viable for him." She set down her pen. "But there's something I didn't use in September. Something I held back because we didn't need it for the county panel." He looked up. "What?" "The deputy commissioner who buried the stamp report in 1812, she said. "I traced his financial records. The property he acquired after retirement is connected through 3 transfers to a land investment company that Greer established in 1810. She paused. "That's not just evidence of the forgery. That's evidence of a conspiracy between a sitting senator and a government official to falsify public records for private financial gain." She held his gaze. That's a criminal matter, Nathaniel, not a legislative dispute. He was very still. If we take this to the right person in Harrisburg, she continued, before Greer files his appeal, the appeal becomes the least of his problems. The Attorney General's office, Nathaniel said slowly. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. You've had this the entire time. I had the financial connection established by October, she said. I was waiting to see if we needed it. We need it. He stood up. He moved to the window. He stood there for a moment, and she could see him calculating the political landscape, the risks, the timing. He knew Harrisburg better than she did. He knew the men and the mechanisms and where the real pressure points were. Greer has allies on the Attorney General's staff, he said. 2, she confirmed. I identified them. They're not the lead investigators. If we go directly to the Attorney General himself— He went to school with my father, Nathaniel said. He turned around. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years. I'll send a letter tonight. I've already drafted it, she said. He looked at her. She looked back, and then quietly, without ceremony, in the lamplight of his study, in the first week of October, Nathaniel Carter began to laugh. It was not the controlled social laughter of a man at a harvest ball. It was something genuine and surprised and helpless, the laughter of a man who had just understood completely that the woman across the desk from him was 3 steps ahead and had been for months. You drafted it, he said. You need to sign it, she replied. And add the personal note at the bottom. Tone matters for that kind of correspondence. He shook his head slowly. He was still almost smiling. Eleanor. The letter is on the left side of the desk, she said. He found it. He read it. She watched him reading it, saw his expression move from assessment to recognition to something that settled into plain, unqualified admiration. He picked up the pen. The personal note, he said, should mention that I'm writing at the joint recommendation of myself and my wife. She looked at him. Joint, he repeated. Because that's accurate. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once. He wrote the personal note. He signed both their names. He sent the letter the next morning. The Attorney General's reply came in 11 days. 11 days was fast. Nathaniel knew it was fast. In Harrisburg, 11 days meant someone had read the letter the same afternoon it arrived and had moved on it immediately, which meant the financial connections Eleanor had traced were not news to the Attorney General's office. They were confirmation of something already suspected, but not yet provable. He told Eleanor this at breakfast. She set down her teacup. They were already watching Greer, she said. Apparently so. The letter asks for a private meeting, within the week if possible. Both of us. He looked at her across the table. Both of us, Eleanor. He specifically asked. She was quiet for a moment. When? Thursday. She nodded. I'll have the documentation organized by Wednesday evening. He looked at her for a moment, at the composure, at the efficiency, at the particular way she was already thinking 3 moves ahead, while the rest of the conversation was still settling. He had watched her do this for months now, and it still produced in him something he could only describe as a kind of astonished respect that had nowhere adequate to go. I'll arrange the carriage, he said. Use the faster team, she replied. The Bay pair. I want to be there before noon. They left Thursday at 5 in the morning. The carriage ride to Harrisburg was the longest stretch of uninterrupted time they had spent in each other's company since the marriage began. 4 hours each way, no estate business to defer to, no staff to redirect attention toward, no convenient interruption available. Just the road and the early morning, and 2 people who had spent the last several months carefully reconstructing something fragile between them. For the first hour they worked. Eleanor had brought the organized documentation, and Nathaniel reviewed it while she walked him through her analysis of the financial connections, the deputy commissioner's property, the 3 transfer records, the land investment company, the dates that placed Greer's involvement, beginning as early as 1810. He asked sharp questions. She gave sharp answers. They moved through it with the efficiency of people who had learned over months of shared crisis to think together without friction. Then the documents were reviewed, and there was nothing left to work on, and the road stretched ahead of them in the early October light. Nathaniel looked out the window for a while. Eleanor looked at her hands. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can always ask," she said. "I may not always answer." "Fair enough." He turned from the window. That first morning, after the ball, when you sat at the breakfast table with your notebook and told me about the mill contract and the tenant farms. He paused. Was that the moment you decided, or had you decided the night before? She considered the question carefully. "The night before I decided to stop waiting," she said. "The morning after I decided to start building." She paused. "They're different decisions." "Yes," he said slowly. "I suppose they are." "Why do you ask?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been trying to identify exactly when I began to understand what I was looking at. And I think—" He stopped, tried again. "I think it was that morning. The way you sat there. The way you didn't explain yourself or apologize for what you were doing. You just did it." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know what to do with that. I'd never seen you like that before." "I'd never been like that before," she said honestly. "Not with you anyway." "What changed?" She met his eyes. "I stopped needing your approval," she said. "And when I stopped needing it, I had room to become someone worth approving of." The words sat in the carriage between them for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Not as an accounting, not to resolve anything. Just, I'm sorry, Eleanor, for all of it." She looked at him for a long moment. The road moved beneath them. The morning light shifted through the carriage window. "I know," she said. That was all. It was enough. The meeting with the Attorney General lasted 3 hours. His name was Lawrence Beaumont, a lean, precise man in his 60s who had the eyes of someone who had spent a career watching people try to deceive him and had become very good at telling when they weren't. He received them in a private office with 2 of his senior investigators present and spent the first 20 minutes asking Eleanor questions rather than Nathaniel. She answered without deferring, without qualifying, without the apologetic preamble women were expected to deploy in rooms like this one. She laid out the financial evidence methodically and explained her sourcing for each element. When one of the investigators challenged her interpretation of the transfer records, she turned to the relevant page, pointed to the specific anomaly, and explained in plain terms why his alternative interpretation didn't hold against the date sequence. The investigator did not challenge her again. Beaumont looked at Nathaniel at one point during Eleanor's analysis, not at the documentation, at Nathaniel's face. Nathaniel was watching his wife dismantle a political conspiracy in a government office as though it were a household account that needed correcting. Beaumont said very dryly, "Your wife is formidable, Mr. Carter." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "she is." By the end of the 3 hours, the Attorney General's office had opened a formal criminal investigation into Senator Aldous Greer and the former Deputy Commissioner, whose convenient retirement property had become considerably less convenient. Greer's legislative appeal against Nathaniel was in effect dead before it was filed. A man under criminal investigation by the Attorney General did not have the standing to pursue a legislative complaint, and everyone in that room knew it. Outside on the steps, Eleanor exhaled. Nathaniel stood beside her. "It's over," he said. "For Greer," she agreed. "Yes." He looked at her. "For us," he said carefully. "I don't think it's over. I think we're somewhere in the middle of something." She looked at him. "That's a more honest assessment than I expected from you," she said. "I'm working on honesty," he said. "It turns out it's harder than legislation." She almost smiled. She caught it before it fully arrived, but he saw it. She could tell from the slight change in his expression, something that opened a little something cautious and hopeful that she was not yet ready to meet directly. "The carriage," she said. "We should start back before the afternoon traffic on the river road." "Of course," he said. They walked down the steps together, and she was aware, in the way you are aware of weather changing, that something had shifted in the space between them. Not resolved, not finished, but different. Easier, less defended on both sides. The particular quality of two people who have survived something together and have come out on the other side of it, changed in ways they are still discovering. The ride home was quieter. They did not work. They did not fill the silence with effort. They simply traveled together, and it was, Eleanor thought, the most naturally they had ever occupied the same space. Greer's investigation became public knowledge within 2 weeks. The Harrisburg newspapers that had once printed the initial land theft allegations now carried the considerably more dramatic story of a sitting senator under criminal investigation for conspiracy record falsification and corruption of a government official. The reversal was complete and very public, and the kind of thing that moved through Pennsylvania political society like a fever, fast and total, and leaving nothing unchanged. Carter Manor received a steady stream of callers in the days that followed. Political allies, neighbors, people who had quietly distanced themselves during the investigation and now returned with the easy confidence of those who had never doubted. Eleanor received them all with the same composed courtesy. She noted who had come during the crisis and who had waited for its resolution. She filed that information as she filed everything without visible judgment. Nathaniel noticed her doing it. "You're keeping a mental record," he said one evening after the last caller had departed. "I always have been," she said pleasantly. He was quiet for a moment. "Anyone I should be concerned about?" "No one you didn't already know to be concerned about," she said. "The Harmon family and the Aldrich brothers. They came back today with very warm congratulations. They were notably absent in September." He nodded slowly. "I'll keep that in mind." "I thought you might," she said. It was the most naturally they had ever talked about his world, the political world, the world of alliances and calculations that he had always kept as entirely separate from the domestic sphere she had been assigned. He was letting her in, not as a courtesy, as a partner. She did not remark on it. She simply continued the conversation. Benjamin Hale completed his contract with the Carter estate in late October. His work was done. The drainage systems were in the crop rotation. Plan was implemented. The orchard slope was prepared and ready for spring planting. He had done everything he had come to do, and done it exceptionally well. He came to say goodbye to Eleanor on a Thursday morning. She met him at the south path near the orchard slope, the same place they had stood in August, looking down at potential. Now the slope was turned earth and careful preparation, and the particular quiet promise of ground that is ready. "It'll be something," he said, looking at it. "In 5 years," she agreed. "Yes." He turned to her. He had the easy directness that had characterized him from the beginning. "Mrs. Carter, I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, if that's all right." "It's always all right," she said. "I came to this estate, and I met a woman who was doing extraordinary work and receiving absolutely no credit for it," he said. "And I watched that change. Not because anyone gave her credit, because she built something that was undeniable." He paused. "I'm glad I was here for part of it. And I'm glad—" He glanced briefly toward the manor where Nathaniel had appeared at the edge of the garden, visible but not approaching. He looked back at Eleanor. "I'm glad it's going the direction it seems to be going." She held his gaze. "Thank you, Benjamin," she said, "for everything you did here, for listening when it mattered." "You didn't need listening to do what you did," he said. "But you deserved it. There's a difference." He offered his hand. She took it. He shook it firmly, the way he had shaken it the first morning, as an equal without condescension or complication. "I hope the orchard is everything you imagined." "It will be," she said. He left. She watched the carriage go down the drive until it turned at the gate. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. "Good man," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "He was." A pause. "He was in love with you," Nathaniel said. It came out evenly without accusation. The statement of a man who had watched something clearly and was acknowledging it because it deserved to be acknowledged. Eleanor considered denying it. She did not. "I don't think so," she said carefully. "I think he admired me. I think he recognized something in me that he respected. There's a difference between that and love." She paused. "And I think he understood very clearly that whatever he felt, it was not something I was available for." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Did you? He stopped. He was not the kind of man who asked questions that exposed him, and this question exposed him completely. He asked it anyway. Did you want to be available for it? She turned to look at him directly. No, she said. That's the truth, Nathaniel. Whatever I was working through this year, whatever distance I needed and took, I was never working through it towards someone else. She held his gaze. What I felt for you didn't disappear. It became something I refused to let myself act on until I trusted that it was returned. That's different. The word returned landed between them. He looked at her with the full weight of everything the last year had been. It is returned, he said, simply, without qualification or management. It has been for longer than I knew how to say. She did not look away from him. She thought about the Mill Creek in Pittsburgh in 1803. About a 9-year-old girl grabbing a boy's arm in cold water because there was no other option. About all the years between then and now, the unrecognized years, the dismissed years, the years of her own slow and painful and ultimately necessary becoming. She thought about the Cassidy Creek and the county hall and the orchard slope and a barn door in October, with a man learning how to repair things he had broken. She thought about 5 years of waiting for a man to see her, and about the 14 months it had taken her to become someone she was glad to be, whether he saw her or not. Both things were true. Both things had been necessary. I know, she said. And she meant it not as absolution, not as the closing of an account, but as the plain acknowledgement of something she had been watching build with her own eyes for months. She knew he meant it. She had been watching him mean it day by day in the language of consistent, unperformed action. He reached out. He didn't take her hand. He offered his open waiting. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. Not tightly, not desperately, with the careful, deliberate pressure of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding. They stood at the edge of the south path and said nothing for a long time, and the October air moved around them, and somewhere below, the prepared earth of the orchard slope held its season of waiting. The winter that followed was the first one at Carter Manor that felt to Eleanor like a home, not because anything was resolved perfectly, or because the history between them had been erased, or because 5 years of distance had suddenly ceased to have consequences. None of that was true. Trust rebuilt itself the way it always does, incrementally, across dozens of ordinary moments, in the specific texture of daily life, shared honestly between two people who had decided to choose each other on purpose. He came to her if he had news. She came to him if she had a problem. They disagreed about the schoolhouse expansion timeline and argued about it at dinner with the direct, unguarded quality of people who had stopped performing and started actually talking. He was wrong about the timeline. He eventually said so. She did not make a ceremony of it. He wrote to 3 families in the valley who had been quietly struggling and offered material support through the winter without attaching his name to the gesture. She found out from Mrs. Pruitt, not from him. She established a charitable fund for orphaned children in the county legal, documented with a formal board. She asked him to sit on alongside her. He said yes before she finished asking. They planted the first apple trees in April. It was a Saturday, and they worked alongside Benjamin's successor, a young man from Lancaster who had studied under Benjamin and came with excellent recommendations, and 3 of the tenant farm families who had asked to be involved. The Hatch children were there. Thomas Garrett brought his eldest son. The Fielding family came with their 3 youngest, who were more interested in the dirt than the planting, but who were told firmly and warmly by Eleanor that they were contributing to history and should take it seriously. Thomas Hatch's youngest daughter, 7 years old, and entirely without shyness, tugged on Nathaniel's sleeve at one point while he was pressing earth around a rootstock. "Mr. Carter," she said, "my mama says Mrs. Carter saved our farm." Nathaniel looked at the child, then at Eleanor, who was across the row working with the Lancaster man on spacing measurements, her hair escaping its pins from the morning's work, her hands dirty, entirely absorbed in what she was doing. "Your mama is right," he said. "Mrs. Carter saved a great many things." The girl considered this. "Did she save you too?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "More than once." The girl nodded, satisfied, and went back to her dirt. Nathaniel stayed crouched beside the young tree for a moment. He pressed the earth firmly around it with both hands. He thought about mill creeks and flooded rivers and ballot rooms, and 5 years of looking past the most important person in his life. He thought about walls built out of old wounds that had ended up costing far more than the wounds themselves. He thought about what it had taken, what she had built, what she had survived, what she had become to finally break through something he should never have built in the first place. He stood up. He walked across the row to where Eleanor was working. She looked up when he stopped beside her. "The hatch girl asked if you saved me," he said. She looked at him steadily. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the spacing measurement. "Hand me the marking stake," she said. He handed it to her. They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon. The orchard grew. Not quickly. Apple trees do not grow quickly, and anyone who plants one understands from the beginning that they are making a promise to the future rather than a claim on the present. The first 2 seasons brought modest growth and careful tending, and the patience of people who understood that the work was its own reward before the harvest arrived. By the 3rd year, the slope had begun to look like what Eleanor had imagined, rows of young trees finding their shape, branches extending toward the light, with the particular quiet confidence of living things that have been properly rooted. By the 5th year, the orchard was the thing she had pictured standing at the top of that slope in August of 1814 with Benjamin beside her, and the whole future of the place still undecided. Apple trees covering the hillside, families from across the valley bringing their children to pick in the fall. The particular sound of harvest laughter and effort, and the soft thud of fruit into baskets echoing up to the manor from a distance. She stood at the top of the slope one September evening watching it. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He had been doing that, coming to find her wherever she was, not out of duty, not out of performance, but with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had stopped needing reasons to be near the person he loved. They stood in the kind of silence that is not empty, but full. The silence of 2 people who have been through enough together that silence itself has weight and warmth. "Do you remember," he said, "what you told me on the carriage ride to Harrisburg?" "I told you several things on that ride," she said. "You said that when you stopped needing my approval, you had room to become someone worth approving of." He paused. "I've been thinking about that for 2 years. And I think you had it right," he said. "But I'd add something." She looked at him. "When you stopped waiting for me to see you," he said, "I finally had something real to see." He paused. "You became yourself. And yourself is—" He stopped. Looked at the orchard. Looked back at her. "There aren't words adequate to it, Eleanor. I've tried to find them. There aren't." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've been doing better than you think," she said quietly. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. She had been letting him for 2 years now, not with the careful hesitation of a woman managing her exposure, but with the open, decided willingness of someone who had chosen on purpose to be here. She laced her fingers through his. The valley stretched before them. The orchard, the fields. The village where Miss Fenn's school had expanded to 2 rooms. And a second teacher, the roads where the tenant farm stood on solid financial ground. The charitable clinic that Dr. Cahill now ran out of a proper building with proper supplies. The lives that had been quietly, consistently changed by the work of 2 people who had learned the hard way what it meant to take care of something beyond themselves. "I spent years searching for something I couldn't name," Nathaniel said. His voice was low, steady, not a speech, not a performance, just the plain truth of a man saying the thing he meant. "I looked for it in politics and property and the management of things that could be controlled." He paused. "I never thought to look beside me." Eleanor tightened her fingers around his. "You're looking now," she said. "I am," he said. "I don't intend to stop." She turned to face him fully. She looked at the man he had become, not through any particular grace of his own, but through the slow, painful, necessary work of being confronted with the truth of himself and choosing repeatedly and without guarantee to change. It was not a romantic story the way she had used to imagine romantic stories. It was better than that. It was real. She had been a girl in a creek who grabbed a drowning boy's arm because she could not do otherwise. She had been a young woman who walked into a marriage with hope and found herself invisible. She had been a wife who made a quiet decision in a dark carriage and built an entire world out of the rubble of her own expectations. She was not any one of those things now. She was all of them. She was Eleanor Carter, the woman who had saved this valley, saved this man, and in doing so had finally irrevocably saved herself. She had not done it for recognition. She had not done it for gratitude, or reward, or the eventual satisfaction of being seen. She had done it because she was the kind of person who could not look at something broken and walk past it. Because her hands knew how to build, before her heart knew how to protect itself. Because love, real love, the kind that survives being tested and still comes back by choice, was not something you waited to receive. It was something you decided to be. She slipped her hand from his and brought it to rest against his chest flat, certain over the steady beat of a heart that had taken far too long to open and was now, she knew, entirely hers. He covered her hand with his own. He did not speak. He did not need to. The orchard breathed around them. The valley held them. The evening came in gold and quiet and full. Love, Eleanor Carter had learned, was not a feeling you fell into. It was a place you built board by board, season by season with your own hands and your full intention and the unshakable decision to keep choosing it even when it was hard, even when it cost you. Even when the person beside you was still learning how. She had built it here. In this valley. In this orchard. In this marriage that had begun as a transaction and become through suffering and stubbornness and grace, something neither of them had known how to imagine at the start. And standing at the top of that hill with the apple trees bearing their first real harvest and the man she loved finally fully present beside her, Eleanor Carter knew with the absolute certainty of someone who has earned every inch of what she stands on, that love chosen daily is the only love that lasts. And she had chosen it. Every single day.